music only lasts for so long, so might as well dance while you still can.
I have been sensitive to spirits all my life, both good and bad, and I was lucky enough to have a mother who was too, so I never had to worry about running to her if something scared me or I couldn't figure it out. When I was 14 in 1980, I had just had a major surgery and was in the Holy Cross Hospital in Utah. It was the 4th of July night, and I was on the 5th floor. I was in a 2-bed room and had the bed by the window. I could see far across the Salt Lake Valley, and I was enjoying all the fireworks when a nurse, one having a bad day I guess, came marching in and said I was supposed to be sleeping. She closed my window curtains and then pulled the curtains around my bed to shut off my view of anything or anybody. I don't recall how long I laid there before I started to get my telltale feelings that a spirit was near. I would get these feelings of electric waves rushing through my body, with a heaviness pushing down on you that felt like you were surrounded in a crowded room, though you were there alone. I made a firm decision that I was going to be brave and confront this spirit, as I knew there would be no help if I called the nurse. I balled up handfuls of sheet in my hands, as if that would give me strength, and I asked out loud, "Who is it? Who's here?" About 2 feet above my head, a head appeared. No body, just a head as real as if someone was there. It was a very old lady with curly, short white hair, lots of wrinkles, and black trimmed glasses. She answered me with a very firm, "It's me, goddammit." And then she blinked out and the room once again became calm. The next morning my mum came to visit me, and I was telling her about my experience. As I was describing this lady and telling her what she said, my mum just busted out laughing. She told me that that was my great-grandma Bird, and that she actually died in this hospital. She told me that Grandma Bird swore like a sailor. Apparently she had died when I was only 1, so I had no memories of her.
Hi, my name is 242, and I got a few ghost stories, but Papa Scare specifically wants something wholesome and sad. So let me start this back when I was about 7 or 8. I was looking at the computer, wanting to make my first ever email. My nephew was in the room with his mother, my older sister Carlene. I looked over her and said, "I don't know what to make my email name." Carlene looked at me, thinking, "You're worried you'll forget?" I nodded. "How about you make it 242 and make the password zoo?" Yes, this was a long time ago. You could make your password that simple. So I typed in 242 and made my password zoo. Also, I forgot that password. I was 7 or 8. Give me a break. Time passed. Carlene was 11 years older than me. I didn't really grow up with her. She was already pretty much gone by the time I was starting to make memories. And she had her son at about 19 or 20. And I'm telling you this to also say I don't have that much memories of her, but I have a lot of good ones. When I was 13, and I know for a fact I was 13, my sister took her own life. She used to come over every Sunday with her son, but that Sunday before that, she didn't. And I knew something was off. She had actually had her son taken away from her through that week due to some things that had happened. And I had a very sinking feeling something was wrong. But I was so young, no one would have listened to me. Before I continue with the story, please, if you feel like this, if you feel like you don't want to go on, or that you don't feel like waking up tomorrow, please reach out to someone. You are loved. You are cared for. And your disappearance will affect more people than you can realize. Because sadly, my sister Carlene didn't know how much she was actually loved. And there was no way for us to help her once she was gone. So there are numbers all over the world for crisis like this. Please, either reach out to someone you trust or get one of these numbers and please call. Because you don't want to go down this path. It's just not a way you can ever go back. Carlene didn't. She was alone and didn't find the help. And she was in pain, and the hole that she left has never been filled in my family. Now, with all that out of the way, let me get to the ghost story part. This all happened during the summer and fall just after she had passed away. Her son, my nephew, were in the backyard in the pool. We were playing, and then we heard the cabinets opening and closing. Something Carlene did a lot, and truth be told, I do to this day. We never locked our front door at the time, or even after this. It took me a little bit to get brave enough. Again, I was 13 and he was like 6 years old. And I walked into the kitchen and it was empty. The whole house was empty. And my nephew had heard it too. We both were staring at each other in the pool, completely afraid of what we were going to find inside. Also, this was the middle of the day, not nighttime. I want to say like 1 o'clock latest. Some more time passes, and I was on the deck that was outside the family room. Now, the family room had some steps, and it was actually a bit lower than the rest of the house. And I was sitting on a chair, talking on the phone, looking at the other patio door that had no deck at the time, that was in the dining room. And it led to a drop. There was absolutely nothing there. There stood Carlene. She was waving at me to come to her. I don't even remember who I was on the phone with anymore. I just know I was scared AF. I went inside and no one was in the dining room. The house, as always, in the middle of the day, was empty. This happened once again. School had started back up, and I was at that deck once more. I truly can't remember why I was, and she was at that dining room door yet again, waving at me to come to her. Scared, I sat or stood there for a while. I can't remember what I was doing, but I know I was home alone again, and my sister, my dead sister, was at that window once more, and I was home alone in the middle of the day. I went inside, and she was gone. That was the last time I saw her. Found out years later her ashes were in the dining room. It was in this metal sealed container. I think she wanted to tell me something, but I'll never be 100% sure of what she wanted to. My best guess is because since a child I have seen ghosts, and I was the only one in the house who believed in them at the time. So maybe she wanted to reach out to me to remind me not to go down her path. Please take care, and remember, not all ghosts want to hurt us, but trust your gut, always. For that saved me from something that did mean to do me harm in the future, in that house.
Just recently, my poor town was hammered by a rain bomb that flooded the town out, drowned it for the first time in its 140-odd years of history. It's used to getting flooded, but not like this. It rose over the levee, 15 to 16 meters high. Fast, flowing water caught us all unaware. Now for my story. I'm a member of a volunteer organisation, an emergency service that specialises in storm and water, land searches and flood rescues. That's what I am, a flood operator. just a fancy name for being a rescuer. My job is to seek, locate, and perform rescues, mostly risking our lives to save others. I've done many. My mate, Simon, and I, we were on the Archangel, a large zodiac, and were going down the flooded streets. Streetlights were out, but the beam of ours was bright enough to navigate through floating debris. We called out, but no one answered, which is a worrying sign. And then Simon swung the beam around to one of the houses, searching it. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Thought I saw someone there. Look." In the beam was a man standing, waving at us, pointing at the roof. We navigated over and climbed onto the roof, but the man was nowhere to be seen, which was again a worrying sign. Below us, we heard someone crying and hammering. We tore the roofing off, and inside, we found an old, 89-year-old woman, water up to her chin, standing on a chair. We got her out and into the boat. I looked around and asked her about the man, but she looked at me, bemusedly. "What man?" Simon told her that we saw a man wearing a plaid shirt which looked outdated, and pants, but no raincoat. She frowned and then smiled sadly. "That'll be my Andrew." "Is he around?" I asked, ready to get out. "Oh no," she shook her head. "Andrew's dead. He died in the 74 flood. He was my disabled son. He drowned while trying to get off the roof. Looks like he was looking after his mum, eh?" Simon and I looked at each other, but said nothing. We brought her back, but told our commander the story. She looked at us and said, "At least the old woman is safe." That night, we went back out and saved a further 20 lives. But the man on the roof will always stay in my memory.
Two years ago, June 2018, my mother had passed after I moved back to my hometown. It was a sudden death, and there is a lot my family and I question. It was ruled a suicide, but my family and I believe her boyfriend may have had something to do with her passing. I can explain more, but this is wholesome paranormal, so I will tell you the wholesome paranormal story. When I first arrived to the town, where my mother was soon to be buried, I had assumed duties of taking care of my 15-year-old sister. My mother's best friend had also arrived around the same time as myself. She took care of us the whole week leading up to the funeral, and the whole week after my mother was buried. All three of us became very close. A day leading up to the funeral is when I started to notice some interesting phenomena happen. The night before the funeral, my mother's boyfriend had showed up to the wake. It was late, I want to say around 9 p.m. or 10 p.m. My sister had noticed him walk into the building while I was visiting with family. She immediately came to me and asked, "What is he doing here?" At first, I had no idea who she was referring to. I panned the room, and I noticed him making his way to my mother's coffin. I beelined straight to him. Thinking about it now, I was way too nice, but I told him, "You are not welcome here. You best get out of here before my uncle sees you." He ended up getting thrown out of the building by my cousin. I was so unbelievably shocked by what had happened and the fact that he had the audacity to show up. My sister and I were so angry. We cried and expressed how angry we were that he showed up. Later that night, we left the building and went to my mother's to sleep, so we could get a good night's rest before the funeral. That night, the town was hit by a huge storm plus the surrounding area. The next day, there were talks of there being a tornado that night, but others say it was a severe thunderstorm. The whole town plus surrounding area had no power. A part of me believes it was my mother. The reason I say this is, there was a tornado that hit my mother's boyfriend's farm. Almost as if my mother knew he had upset my sister, myself, and my family that night. Now I know weather is strange and anything can happen. However, more phenomena continued to happen throughout the day. The funeral was supposed to happen. The morning after the storm, I woke up to a tree that had fallen in the driveway. Not only did this happen in my mother's driveway, but it also happened to all my aunts. I have 6. They were supposed to get to the building where the funeral was being held early at 5 a.m. to start cooking for the funeral. The day leading up to the funeral, I felt as though my family and I were not ready to say goodbye to my mother. After this storm happened, we were unable to have the funeral because the power was out from 4 a.m. to 8 p.m. We ended up having to postpone the funeral one day. The day of the funeral, things seemed to be going fine. Some of my friends from high school had shown up, and one friend, we will call her Allie. Allie had shown up just before the funeral started. She sat a few rows behind me. She had joined me once all the friends and relatives were saying their final goodbyes. My mother's immediate family said their final goodbyes last. Allie was standing next to me when my mother's siblings were saying their goodbyes. When Allie looked at me and said, "Your mum said look for her in the butterflies." She had said it quickly and fast. I looked at her quizzically and said, "What did you just say?" Allie looked me in the eyes and said, "Your mother wanted me to tell you to look for her in the butterflies." I couldn't believe what she told me. All I could do was cry. It was now my sisters and I's turn to say our final goodbye. We were the last ones to say goodbye. My sister and I went up to the coffin, said our goodbyes, and closed the casket together. We both turned around and walked away. At first, I thought my sister was right beside me. I felt someone grab my shoulder, almost as though they were trying to comfort me. Initially, I thought it was my sister, until I turned around and saw no one beside or behind me. I was a little confused at first, but I think it was my mother telling me everything will be okay. When we all went to the cemetery, there were a few monarchs flying around. One of them flew around my sister and I for a while and landed in a tree next to us. I felt like it was looking over the burial of my mother. It was watching over my sister and I. This is my first time doing this. I'm sorry it was so long. I think about this often and wonder if all the things happened was my mother communicating with us. I like to think the storm was her sticking up for herself and our family. I also like to think all the things I experienced afterwards was my mother letting us know she is okay. And it will be okay, even after we say goodbye.
I had a less than 1-year-old fluffy orange kitten who I grew extremely attached to. While he was alive, he was battling an unknown illness. The ER vet thinks it may have been FIP. When he died, I was heartbroken. My dad helped me bury him in my backyard, and I ordered a little granite headstone for him that had his picture etched into it. My aunt lives with me, and when I showed her the headstone I ordered, we were both standing in the kitchen, and all of a sudden, we both heard a meow. It wasn't my other cat because he was asleep in another room, and the meow came from the kitchen. My aunt and I were both sure of that. It freaked both of us out a little that we suddenly heard a meow from nowhere as I was showing her the headstone. My hope is that it was my kitten's spirit, sensing that the headstone was for him, and meowing in approval.
I was a year 2 nursing student from College East in 2006. I was attached to SGH for my IA as it was part of my module to pass my course. It happened in Block 4, Level 3. I was attached to the ward there. Those who are nurses should know where I'm talking about. I have to spend 2 months there in that ward as I was in my 3rd week and I was serving a patient. His kidney was on a 2nd stage of renal failure, so which means that he is not too far from 3rd stage, which will cause him to die. As I spent a week serving him, I got to know about his family and his life. He was quite a friendly uncle, which often helped him pass my time faster through my shifts in my attachment, so I kinda spend more time with him talking than the other patients. After spending a good 2 weeks serving him, he has really become a friend. Then, on a Friday afternoon, when it was the end of my shift, I bid my farewell to him and that I'll see him on Monday as a healthier man. Monday came and I came in as usual. It was 7:15 a.m. and I was alone sitting at the counter waiting for the change of shift. I saw my favorite uncle walking to pass the counter to the toilet. I called out to him saying, "Hey, uncle, you can walk already. That's good, that's good. Slowly walk, okay? Or you want me to help you?" He replied calmly, "It's okay, boy. I'm good. You've been a great help already. You got work to do, right? Go. Then he continued to walk on. As he turned into the corner before to enter the gents, he turned around and said, "Really, boy, thank you so much." As a nurse, you get these things kind of a lot, so I just went on doing my stuff. And as the shift changed and the passing of reports came, the report of my uncle was not mentioned in the daily report, so I questioned about his status. All the staff nurses were confused. "Why are you asking about him?" Then I said that I just saw him walking to the toilet just now. All the staff were shocked. Then one of the senior staff pulled me aside to ask me to stop talking. Then she told me that he had died yesterday due to a sudden worse renal failure, which the doctors couldn't save. I did not believe it at first. I ran to check his former bed, and none of his stuff were there. Then I ran to check the toilet, and no one was inside at all. I couldn't believe it, but after a while, I accepted his death, and I went to read his case notes. He was pronounced dead the same time as I saw him on that very day, 7:15 a.m.
My best friend passed away in 2014. I was in school at the time, so I was distraught and didn't know how I would carry on living. To this day, even being married with kids, I still feel like my life is just an epilogue, like my life was paused that day when I found out he died. Fair to say, I was gutted. Anyway, I got really into my PC gaming and would play Counter-Strike with my other friends that I met in college. And it's funny because thinking back on it, I never felt alone, even when it was just me, when my friends were busy all day. One night, I dreamt about him. He met me at the Spear Pillar, a location from a Pokemon game we both loved, and he hugged me, and it was as if it was his younger self had matured, while being 2 to 3 years on the other side. I felt a stubble against my cheek. It was surreal. Further on, he told me that I needed to stop worrying about him and that he was always there with me, be it on the bus, chilling at home, or at college. He said he was always there. Then he said something that quite frankly blew my mind. He mentioned how it's so nice of me to keep the spot at the end of the bed clear for him to sit down on, as it's his favorite spot every night. He loves to watch me play CSGO, especially with my mates. The conversation made me laugh. He said no matter where I am, he'll always find me and keep me company. It's crazy because subconsciously, I would always clear my bed, bearing in mind my room isn't always the tidiest, but as an adult I've gotten better. So I'm glad to have met him, and even when I'm away on deployment or putting my kids to bed, I still feel him around that it makes me happy and nostalgic. In 2017, I got a tattoo dedicated to him. It was my very first. I just miss my friend.
This year, I'm celebrating my 30th birthday. It's gonna be the first time since birth I'm not celebrating this moment with the brave lady who raised me, along with my grandfather. My grandmother died after years and years of suffering. It's a relief, but damn, it hurts. A few hours before her death, the last day I saw her, I slept a few hours to recover from this terrible night as she asked mercy. In this dream, I saw her dead, laying on the bed. Her husband held her and cried. I immediately sent a message to my companion to tell him about the disturbing picture I've seen a few times, since the idea of losing her caused me huge anxiety issues. Then, right after this nightmare, I learned about her. She passed away as I was peacefully sleeping in my bed. It's been a month she's gone now. And I know it's strange, but I totally stopped dreaming about her. This morning, I just woke up in my family's house. I heard the distinct voice saying, "Hi." It was nice and sweet. I responded, "Yes." As my grandfather, who sleeps in his room next to mine, answered, "Yeah?" I asked him if he was calling me and said no. I used to work in a funeral home for years as a counselor. I know grief may lead to hallucinations. Have you ever had a dream about your loved ones who eventually died moments ago? Do you think it's pure coincidence, a simple sign of empathy since I felt extremely worried about her? Do you think I, myself, talked while I was asleep? I know a lot of my friends confirmed I'm a sleep talker. Anyway, that's not the most thrilling experience I witnessed, but I'm curious about these two moments. First, the dream. Secondly, the call. I respect your beliefs. I'm open-minded. Feel free to share. Take care.
The other night, I was heading home and I saw a woman who looked a little worse for wear, like she had a few too many on board. She was getting harassed by some guy, so I went over to see if she was alright, and to help her out. To cut a long story short, she grabbed my shirt as she was falling, and I think she gripped the pocket of my shirt or something, because it ripped and tore a seam in the shirt. I was really annoyed and upset, to be honest. It was my favorite shirt. It was the last birthday present I ever got from my wife, before she passed away, and so it genuinely upset me. But I guess there are other ways to ruin a shirt. At least I was trying to help someone and I didn't spill something on it or rip it through my own clumsiness. Still, it was a shame, but it couldn't be helped. So anyway, I decided to hang on to that shirt. Or maybe I should say I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. I figured I could still use it just as long as I didn't wear it outside of the house. So I washed the shirt and I hung it up in the wardrobe. That night, I had a dream. It was the first dream I had in a very long time. I dreamt that I came home just as I did that night, but the only difference was I didn't come home to an empty home. I walked through the door and I saw my wife stood in the hallway, and she was looking right at me. She looked at my shirt and tutted and said, "What's that?" She told me to give it to her, so I took it off and she instantly went to work on it at the dining room table with a needle and a thread. I went upstairs to go and change into another shirt, and I came back down and sat at the sofa. I was looking over at her as she was working on sewing up my shirt, and that's all I remember. It was a nice dream. The next day, I had plans with my daughter to go to the cinema to watch a movie and catch up. She's been living alone for quite some time. I was wondering what to wear. I opened my wardrobe as usual, and I noticed my favorite shirt. I took a look at it again to see how bad the rip was, and to my surprise, I couldn't find it. I turned it over again and again in my hands, and I still couldn't find any tear. I couldn't believe it. I looked at the back of the shirt, and I noticed something. It was sewn up from the back so that the rip wasn't visible at the front. I wondered how the hell that this was possible, and then I remembered my dream from last night. I thought to myself, no way, she stitched it up for me? I just didn't know how to comprehend the situation. It was so strange, but I guess I knew what I was supposed to be wearing. So I took the shirt out of the wardrobe and I threw it on. I told my daughter about my dream and the shirt. She looked at me and said, "Oh, Dad, knowing you were probably drunk and imagined it all. I bet there was no rip in the shirt." As she said this, I could see tears welling in her eyes. I knew what she truly believed about my dream, even if she couldn't bring herself to say it out loud. I was amazed. That's really the only word for it. I mean, I got to see my wife again, and my shirt was fixed. I'm still kind of speechless. That's just like her, you know, always helping me out in situations like that. I am hoping that this could be a regular thing. I tell you what, I would love to come home one day and have some of her cooking waiting for me again. Or I'd love to see it in the fridge.
So this story has about 3 different accounts, so you're in for a ride. For some background information, my grandma had a twin sister that died from complications of HIV, which she contracted from an unfaithful husband. She died 16 years before I was born, in her late 50s. This is all going to make sense later. The first time I saw her was when I was 5. I was living in a little town in Massachusetts, about 60 miles off from Boston. My mother was a single mom, businesswoman at the time, so she had an overnight trip to Boston and left my oldest sister Tiny in charge. No, her real name isn't Tiny. It's just what we call her, and it's pronounced Deanie. We'll fast forward to bedtime, and me and my 5 other siblings are all tucked in, ready for bed. I'm going to assume it was around 9 o'clock. I woke up in the middle of the night from a really bad nightmare, which is still reoccurring to this day. Long story short, it's a dream where I'm taken underwater. A dark, almost pitch black hand that's very demon-like is holding me under until I eventually die, I guess. So as any 5-year-old would, I ran to my mother's room for comfort, not remembering my mother was out of town. Well, to my surprise, there was a lady sitting on my mother's bed, looking at the family album. Usually I would have been confused, but the second I walked into the room, I didn't feel so scared anymore. It felt like I'd walked into a warm hug, but she wasn't even near me. The lady was red-headed and beautiful in a kind of old way. The kind of way where you could just tell that they were popular in high school. The lady saw me in distress, got up from the bed, and picked me up, laid me on my mother's bed. Then she started singing in Spanish, a lullaby I'd never heard of, yet I knew every word to it. By the time I knew it, I was sound asleep. My little brother walked into the room and saw the lady crooning over me, caressing my cheek while I slept. I don't know what possessed him to not care and go back to bed, but he noped out of there fast. Well, when my mom finally came home, it was about 7 a.m., and she was tired. She saw me in her bed and was surprised. She woke me up and asked me why I wasn't in my bed, and I told her the nice lady let me stay here. She asked me, "What lady?" And I said I don't know her name, but she has red hair, and she sang me a song, and she was really beautiful. She then looked to her right and saw her album open. Please note, she keeps it on her bedside table, but it was already randomly opened to this picture. She looked at the picture, and let out a really relieved sigh. She turned around and showed me a picture of the same woman that I saw, asked me if it was her. I said yeah, and I asked her, who is she? She said that it was my guardian angel, and I just took that and said, okay, I'm 5. I didn't care. Now fast forward to when I'm 11. It was my first day of school, and the first time my mother allowed me to walk to the bus stop alone. Well, I got hit by a car, but it wasn't my fault. It was a residential area that had a speed limit of like 15 miles per hour. He was going well over that, and I was really small, so he didn't see me. From the accident, I got 3 broken ribs, a broken wrist, broken legs, fractured, and a bad concussion because my head was split. I don't remember it, but next thing I knew, I woke up in the hospital to my mom crying, saying she's sorry and that she's happy I'm okay. I had to stay in the hospital for a week for observation because my broken rib was so close to puncturing my lungs. My mom worked a lot, and she had nobody else to watch me, so I spent my nights alone. I got lonely and scared and just had a really bad feeling. So you guessed it, Miss Ma'am came back. I woke up in the middle of the night to her at the edge of my hospital bed, looking at me. At first I was scared. I didn't recognize who the hell she was. But then this warm feeling came back, and I realized I wasn't lonely or worried anymore. Then she hummed that song, and I swear to God, I didn't know the lyrics. I barely speak Spanish. But it's like my soul knew, and before I knew it, I was fluently singing it with her in Spanish until I fell asleep. Now this third time, I didn't see her, but it was more like she let me know that she was there. When I was 18, I got married to a boy I thought I loved, and he went to the military. Long story short, he was abusive. He cheated, lied, put his hands on me, and broke me. Not solely because of my marriage, but definitely a big reason. I fell into a really deep depression and had self-harm habits. One night, it all got too much, and I don't know what he said to send me over the edge, but I was in the bathroom looking at a bottle of Oxy, and I started to take a few just to kind of drown out the heavy feeling. After a few minutes, when I took another, then another, eventually, I started to feel that very thin line between an overdose and lucidity. Then, that feeling happened again, and the song started playing in my head, like if I had a radio in there. And I felt okay. I felt like someone was there for me. In a way, I feel like it was a sign that I wasn't meant to go just yet. And with that, I left him a few months later, and I've never looked back. I haven't seen her since. Around the same time, I finally asked my mother about it, and eventually everything started to make some sense. She told me about my grand aunt and how she passed, and that when she was younger, she was a motherly figure to her because her own mother wasn't a very fit parent. She'd often have to seek comfort from her, and when I was about 5, I looked like a literal carbon copy of my mother. She theorized that maybe her spirit saw me upset and, thinking I'm my mother, wanted to console me. And get this, my mother, when recounting her aunt, was very emotional. So she started talking about some nursery rhyme that she used to sing her. It was the song. My mother sang it word for word in front of me. That's what cemented her story to me as fact. I'm 22 now, and I'm in one of the most loving and healthy relationships I've ever dealt with. I've been sober for 4 years, And I have a much more healthy state of mind now, in case you were wondering. I know this story was long, but I hope if you take anything from my experience, it's that it gets better. You just have to stick around long enough for life to do its magic.
When I was 19, my best friend was diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer. We knew her cancer was terminal, and she had a life expectancy of 5 years at most. Her and I would talk every now and again about passing on, and how even though I was healthy, I could always go before her in a car crash or some other way. We made a pact that no matter which one of us left first, we would come back to the other and let them know that there was more to life after death. She eventually passed away from her illness at 22 years old, leaving behind her husband and 3-year-old son. She passed away on a Sunday at 8:20 a.m. And I remember the call from her husband vividly. He asked me to bring her son to the hospital because she had passed away. That day was a complete blur. I couldn't find myself to come to the reality that she was no longer with us. It all felt unreal. We were allowed to be with her for a few hours in her hospital room before she was taken away. While we were with her, I don't know. I was just in complete shock and my mind just couldn't process it. I didn't even cry. Leaving the hospital was even more strange, because at the time, I had no children. And my life completely revolves around my work, my home, and her. She lived a few minutes from my job at the time, so I would always leave work very early to see her, whether she was at home or the hospital. I loved her so much. I could never be away from her. So now, knowing I had to go home and try to process that I would never see her again just threw my life for a spin. At night I couldn't sleep. I just kept trying to make sense of it all. And in all honesty, I don't even remember the thoughts that were going through my head, but the feelings of loss and confusion were very prevalent to me. I couldn't sleep at all, but at around 3 a.m, I felt the most beautiful and reassuring feeling I've ever felt. I felt what I can only describe as a warm hug take over me from head to toe, and I fell asleep. That night I had a dream. In my dream, I called her husband to let him know that she had written me a letter. He then tells me that it's funny because she left him a voicemail. He then asked me to read him the letter, so I read it to him. In this letter, she tells us how thankful she is that we were in her life. She thanked us for taking care of her and loving her. She asked us to please watch over her son, and she is okay, and no longer in pain. She also tells us that we will all be okay. As I finished telling him about the letter, my mom comes into my room and woke me up. She asked me for a pen and paper. I hand her a piece of paper I had, and she starts to write. When she finishes, she hands it to me, saying she didn't know why, but something told her to write this and then give it to me. When I read the letter, it was word for word what my best friend had told me in my dream, and she signed it with her father's last name. Now, my mom only knew her by her mother's last name. No one outside her close relatives and myself knew her father's last name, so I was very confused as to how she signed it with her father's last name. I asked her why or how she wrote this. My mom didn't know. She just wrote. I explained to her about my dream, and she was just as surprised as I was. I immediately called her husband and told him about the letter and my dream. He agreed they were all her words. My best friend came through with her promise. This made me a believer. I know there's more after death.
I was pregnant with my second child in 1997. My husband and I had our first baby 4 years prior, but always wanted to expand our family. I didn't really envision having a larger family. However, it was my husband's dream to be a dad to many kids. In June of 1997, my husband, Jack, passed away on his way home from work when a truck ran a red light just a few miles away from our house. To any of you who have lost a spouse, I don't have to explain the torment your emotions and body go through afterwards. I spent several months only leaving the house to go to doctor's appointments and grocery shopping. Unexpectedly, I found myself in another relationship in July of the following year. He has since become my husband and cares for my 2 girls like they were his own. He loves to hear stories of my deceased husband. He supports me when he knows I'm feeling down about Jack. My second daughter spent the first 6 months of her life being a very fussy baby. She rarely slept through the night, which meant that I spent the majority of my nights sleeping in a rocking chair in the nursery. She eventually grew out of this phase and would sleep from 8 p.m. until 7 a.m. each day. During this time, my now husband would also tend to her when she would wake up in the morning, just to give me a little more sleep. This phase, unfortunately, didn't last very long. She started becoming fussy throughout the night again. We would both take shifts to lessen the load on each of us. The following incident has only ever happened once. I still don't have any explanation for it. My daughter was crying for hours on end. I was rocking her back and forth, which usually did the trick. Nothing. I must have spent 2 or 3 straight hours in the nursery trying to calm her down, just to the point where I could make my way back to bed. I kept whispering to her, "Please sleep, sweetie. Mom is very tired." After another 15 or 20 minutes, she eventually calmed down, and I laid her in her crib and made my way back to bed. My husband was sitting upright in bed and waiting to see if he needed to go take over. She seemed silent at this point, so we just sat up and talked about if she maybe started teething or wasn't feeling good. She started crying again over the monitor. Occasionally, she will cry for 5 or 10 seconds and then fall back to sleep. I told my husband to wait a moment just to see if this would happen. She continued for another few minutes. We silently listened to the baby monitor in hopes that she'd calm herself down. The silence was broken when we heard what neither one of us are able to describe. "Please go to sleep. Your mom is very tired." Both of us looked at each other with pale expressions on our face. I was frozen to the bed. I swear, that was the voice of Jack. It took us a few moments to go into the nursery. We didn't find anyone. The room was completely empty, aside from my sleeping daughter. I didn't ever believe in the paranormal before. However, this is something that I don't think I'll ever be able to explain.
This isn't my story, but one that I heard from a member of my caving club. The story is a bit distressing, but I think that it serves a purpose, so please, hear me out. In Iwate Prefecture, there are numerous caves. Back when this story takes place, it wasn't as touristy as it is today, so many of the caves lay unmapped and partially unexplored because internal surveys weren't often conducted. Back then, survey events were held within the caving community, and this story concerns a very large cave survey on a winter's day. Participants broke up into groups with the more experienced members of the club trying to map and investigate the cave. There were areas which had already been mapped, and some of the caving club members grew a bit bored of measuring areas of the cave. They were more interested in taking photos and looking for wildlife. This was not a good idea. This is why I guess we're told this cautionary tale when we joined the club. One of the cave explorers decided to crawl down a narrow opening in the cave. The others in the club knew, based on the survey, that there was nothing but a dead end. So, initially, they weren't concerned. Unfortunately, that changed quickly. We knew that he would go in, find nothing, and probably squirm his way back out backwards, since it was incredibly narrow. But after a few minutes passed, he didn't come back. We all gathered around and began to panic. We looked at the tiny crevice that he managed to crawl through, and Then someone in the club asked aloud, "Is there enough room to turn around in there?" Another chimed in with what we were all thinking. Did he get stuck? And there was a sober silence which was broken by the sound of someone shuffling. He came back out of the crevice. I can't tell you how relieved I was to see him. Something was wrong, though. He looked jaded and frightened. Not only that, he didn't come back out backwards. He came out facing everyone. It seemed impossible. Then he began to mumble about what had just happened in the narrow crevice. I got to a dead end, but there was something more. There was an even narrower hole. For some reason, I poked at it and discovered that the earth beneath the hole could be moved aside. After working at this for a while, I managed to get the hole wide enough to fit both of my arms through, then my whole body. It opened up into a reasonably wide chamber. That's how he was able to turn around. He went on, "I thought I had found an undiscovered part of the cave, and I was really excited. I shone my torch all over the cave, and my torchlight fell on something. A doll, or maybe a mannequin was lying on the cave floor. I had heard of seeing things in caves, stalagmites which appear to look human, as well as odd formations of mud on the cave floor. I was aware that my eyes could play tricks on me in the dark, too, but none of this accounted for the fact that the human-shaped mass was wearing glasses." "So, you think it was human?" He nodded his head silently. The caving club left and called the police. Later, the body was identified. According to the police, it was the body of a high school student who had went missing a few years ago. He entered the cave with candles and some sweets, so we can establish that he had intent to explore the cave. But for what purpose? Some speculate it was because he wanted to commit suicide. Others say he must have just wanted to explore. Perhaps it was his own little secret base. Due to this portion of the cave being almost completely shut off, his body had been preserved from the elements. The only issue was that muddy water from above had dripped on to the body. One strange thing was, the glasses did not have a drop of muddy water on them. If you've never been in a cave with no source of light, perhaps I can help you imagine what it's like. I've been in caves where I have turned the torch off just for a second. It was so dark that I couldn't tell whether my eyes were open or shut. I tried to stay in the dark as long as possible. The longest I could manage was about a minute. But I think that the everyday ordinary person could keep their sense of balance for about 10 minutes. After that, you wouldn't know up from down. Then, the mind wanders. The things in the dark, they can tolerate it, but man can't. The sounds, the loss of direction, it all adds up. It all takes a toll. The poor high school boy could have lasted 30 minutes or so without panic in there. I'm assuming that there was some sort of cave-in which buried the only exit. Things would have gotten worse when his matches got wet, or perhaps he couldn't find where he put the candles. At this point, he would have regretted his decision to enter the cave, as there would be no one around to hear his whimpers or screams for help. He would be cursing himself time and time again for coming or not bringing a torch, maybe even wishing he had told someone where he was going. How many times did he trace his hands along the walls looking for that exit? Back and forth, back and forth. How many days did he live? What kind of hallucinations did he see? Unsure if he was awake or asleep, hallucinating or thinking straight, hunger or thirst. One of those would have come for him towards the end, but not before his mind tormented him further. Maybe he didn't even truly feel like himself towards the end. Maybe his identity faded into the darkness. How many times did he scream? Scratch the walls? Cry? He would have died without even realizing he was alive or dead, staring back into the corner, hiding from whatever was tormenting him, his glasses resting on his nose, pointing towards the exit he could no longer find. I think this is the most terrifying and tragic death that I've ever heard. Please, do not explore caves alone or without equipment. Tell people where you are going, and above all, stay safe.
This happened last June, and back in those days, I was a motorcyclist. I bought my bike after I graduated, and I used to ride it at every chance I got. I didn't even have a direction in mind. I just loved riding. I was riding one evening, and I knew that I had a day off on the following day, so I felt like going kind of far. I had a good night out riding, and I decided to head home sometime after midnight. I was on my way back towards Setagaya in Tokyo. The roads were not so busy. I was taking it easy, and as if all of a sudden the car in front stopped. It stopped at such a speed that it collided with the guardrail. I was shocked to see an accident happen right before my eyes. I had no other choice but to pull over and try to figure out what happened. I raced over to the driver's side window and I saw that the driver was female. She was visibly distressed. She couldn't stop shaking her head and her hands were firmly clamped on the steering wheel. Oh, this is bad, I thought to myself. I started off by asking if she was all right, in as gentle of a tone as I could muster. I waited a few seconds, but she didn't reply to my question. I started to panic. This was serious. I realized that I should call the police, so I did. While waiting for the police, I asked several times if the woman was all right, and eventually she got out of the car. She didn't look hurt, but her skin had gone very pale, almost to the point it looked blue. She was muttering something. I couldn't make out what she was saying, so I leaned my ear close to her mouth. She kept murmuring, "What have I done?" I could hear the tremble in her voice, and then, as if in answer to her own question, she said something. "I've run over a child." She kept repeating these words. Her voice gathered strength and volume, and it was very hard to listen to her panicked wails. I was deeply disturbed. It was a frightening situation. Then I remembered that I was behind her, and I didn't see a child in the road. I was certain that there was no one around, plus it was the dead of night. I looked back, and I couldn't see a child anywhere. I sat with that woman and tried to calm her down for a while, but occasionally I stood up and went in search of the child she thought she'd hit with her car. There were no children in the area. A few moments later, the police arrived. I spoke with one of the officers, and he searched with me for this child. The officer asked me about what happened repeatedly, and I repeatedly told him that all I saw was the lady in front swerve and hit the guardrail. I said that I didn't see anyone on the road. The officer went and asked the woman about what had happened, and I went with him to listen. According to the woman, she saw a young child dart out into the road ahead of her car, and she heard and felt the collision. But no matter what we did, and no matter where we searched, we couldn't find the child. The officer started back towards his patrol car while talking into his radio, and the woman was looking around the road absent-mindedly. I watched as her eyes fell on the roadside mirror. You know those mirrors you sometimes see in rural areas that allow you to see oncoming traffic around the bends? They're a circular type, and they're usually on a pole high enough for the driver to see, but not be distracted. I think they're sometimes known as convex mirrors. Well, that's what she looked at. She laid her eyes on it. A terrible scream rose from the pit of her stomach. The officer was as shocked as I was to hear this, and he rushed over to her. He noticed that she was looking at something in the roadside mirror. I came over to look as well. We looked into the mirror and saw a child in the road. There was no one there when we looked without the help of a mirror, but when we looked into the mirror, the child was there. It was the strangest thing I've ever seen. I couldn't believe my eyes. The child looked to be about 4 or 5 years old. She was wearing a kindergarten uniform. She looked like the kid that went to a good school. That child stared at us with an utterly expressionless look on her face. The police officer and I turned to look at the road almost simultaneously, and there was no child in the road. We looked back at the mirror, and we could only see ourselves and the female driver sat on the side of the road. Our faces looked incredibly pale, and our mouths hung open in shock. The woman then exploded into a full-blown state of panic, and the ambulance that was intended for the child took the woman away, but not before she went and asked me for my contact information, saying she might call to ask me about what had happened. And the officer said that for her sake, it wouldn't be a good idea, and it would be better to forget about the incident entirely. His face as white as snow. I insisted that the officer should take my information, but there was to be no further contact from anyone I met that day. I am sorry, but it has left me very confused and troubled. I think about it often. What really happened that day is a mystery to me, but I believe that I had a run-in with the paranormal, and that little girl's spirit remains in the spot she met her final moments.
This happened in January of 2019. My stepdad had been in our family's life for 30 years before he was diagnosed with cancer. He never had any biological children, but he had me and my sister, and we couldn't have asked for a better stepdad or granddad for our children. I was with him when he was diagnosed and with him for all of his treatments. From the very beginning, there was no question of who would take care of him. It was going to be me. He and my mother were split up at the time, and it just seemed natural that I would be the one to do it because of how close we were. And honestly, I considered it an honor. Unfortunately, his prognosis was not very good, and they gave him less than a year to live. He barely made it 6 months after his diagnosis. He was in the hospital the last 6 days of his life. He had a DNR in place, and as hard as it was, I didn't argue with him about it. 2 days before he passed, he was in and out of consciousness and was barely able to talk. But his last night, he was able to communicate that he really wanted me to go home and check on the dogs. This was just after 3 o'clock in the morning. I told him I would do that, and then I would be right back. He gave me a small smile and nodded. It took 20 minutes for me to get home, and 10 minutes after walking through the door, the hospital called and said he had passed. I felt so guilty for leaving until I thought, he knew there was already someone with the dogs, but he insisted that I check on them. Perhaps he didn't want me there at that time. I don't know. I still don't know. But what I do know is that the morning after he passed, I had a missed call from his phone, which had been in my purse the whole time he was in the hospital. The call was made at 3:47 a.m., and the voicemail that was left said, "Thank you for everything, sweetheart. I love you." That message was left in my stepdad's perfect, loving voice, not the raspy, out-of-breath, strained voice he had moments before he died. Some people have said that it may have just been an old message that I had just received that morning, but either way, I thought it was amazing.
I'm a hiker. I love the mountains. I found this thread, and it seems like a good place to share my experience. During the coldest period of the year, I climbed Mount Daisetsuzan in Hokkaido. It was freezing, one of the coldest winters I've ever experienced. Despite the winter temperature, that day the weather was gorgeous, even from the early morning, the perfect day for climbing. But it was winter. and the weather can change in the blink of an eye up in the mountains. During the afternoon, the clouds in the sky looked dark and worrisome, and in no time at all, an intense snowstorm had started up. It was a bit too late to turn back, and it would have been incredibly dangerous to do so. I knew that if I kept climbing, I would get to a cabin which was built as an emergency shelter. But I was worried that I wouldn't be able to find it due to the whiteout. I didn't even know my position on the mountain. I was prepared to camp out in a bivouac if necessary. You know, like a tent. I have a lot of experience in climbing, hiking and camping, and I came prepared that day. I was prepared, but to be honest, I wasn't looking forward to the prospect of camping in a snowstorm. Just as soon as these thoughts came to mind, the weather turned again. The snowstorm was showing signs of slowing. I could see my way again, and after a short while, I knew where I was. I didn't risk it. I headed straight to the emergency shelter. This took me about 2 hours. I was feeling very anxious and worried, but despite my anxiety, I found the cabin. It was almost entirely covered by snow. The sun was beginning to set. You know how early the sun can set in winter. I didn't want to be out there in the dark. I was so relieved to find the cabin, I have to say. When I went in, I noticed that there was 2 others in there. They were lying down, sleeping. I didn't want to wake them up, so I quietly closed the door. I laid out my sleeping bag and got in. I wanted to be warm. After warming up a little, I made a quick dinner with my provisions, and then I laid down to sleep. I woke up during the night. I don't know how long I slept for, hours, minutes. I was awakened by some mumbling sound. I guessed that it was the voices of those hikers who were in the cabin with me. I listened carefully, and it sounded like there was a man and a woman speaking. It sounded like they were talking about the trip they were planning tomorrow and the weather. I could hear some muffled laughter at points. I was thinking, why not just save this chat for the morning? Include me too. If we're going the same way, then let's help each other out. While I was thinking about all of that, I fell back into a deep sleep. I woke up the following morning. The atmosphere felt heavy. After a moment or two of being awake, about 10 men came rushing into the cabin. It scared the hell out of me. It was as cold as ice in that cabin. One of the men said to me, "Oh God, are you still alive?" I didn't know what the hell he was talking about. I had just woken up and I was confused. Then another one of the men said, "No, it's them over there." He gestured with his chin in the direction of the man and the woman I was sharing the cabin with. I asked what was going on, and I was told that the 2 with me had radioed for rescue, but unfortunately, due to the terrible snowstorm, the rescue helicopter couldn't get up to them. The only choice the rescuers had was to go by foot, and it took 2 days to reach them on the mountain. Sadly, it was too late for the couple. They passed away due to exposure at a higher point in their climb. The rescue men were unable to bring the bodies down the mountain because the weather took another turn, so a decision was made to leave their bodies in the emergency shelter cabin rather than risk a double tragedy. These men were back to transport the bodies down the mountain. I couldn't get my head around it. I couldn't grasp the situation. What about the mumbling voices I heard? What about their conversation about how they were going to get down the mountain? Hallucinations and auditory hallucinations are not uncommon in the harshest of winters, apparently. Is that what this really was? I wasn't convinced. I asked if they were a couple because the way they had been speaking to one another sounded like they were. They confirmed that they were newlywed. This climb was part of their honeymoon. Furthermore, the male was apparently known to this mountain rescue team. He was a prolific climber. I was advised to leave the mountain range before the weather took another turn. I took that advice. I made it safely down the mountain, and I had a long time to think about the experience I had. I still think about it often. When I heard that I had spent the night with 2 fresh bodies, I was at first creeped out, especially since I had heard them talk to one another. I thought about the voices I heard. They were cheerful and not frightening. Like I said, they even laughed with one another at points. That kind of warms my heart. The mountains are wonderful places. I heard them say they were planning on leaving the mountain in the morning, and I really hope they did. I hope that they're at rest. If I pass on in the mountains, I'd like to think I'd be alright with that. Thinking about my experience in this way makes me feel better about the whole thing.
I don't really know if this belongs here. And this is really the only experience I had that I couldn't really explain. About a week and a half ago, my grandfather on my dad's side of the family finally passed. He had already passed away a long time ago. Sometime when I was in middle school, he became a hollow man with the lights on, but no one home. When he was there, he loved his grandchildren and loved bonding with us, especially me. I was the more sporty one, and we connected with that, and bonded. The night he passed, I woke up in the middle of the night with a warm, fuzzy, familiar feeling. I didn't feel alone. The room was filled with his scent, and I started to tear up. I didn't think him passing would make me cry, because I already did when I realized he no longer knew who I was. But this feeling made me cry. The smell, the familiar warm feeling. It was really weird. I told my dad about it, and he started tearing up and said, "Yeah, buddy, he definitely visited you before leaving our world. I bet he visited all his family before seeing the rest. I am still iffy on paranormal things, and I'm trying to think of anything it could have been, but I'm blank. I really think he came to say the goodbye he never was able to say. I love you so much, Papa Jeff."
I want to tell you a couple of stories about when I used to live on the streets as a homeless man. It was hell living on the streets. The stares and the looks of disgust were nothing compared to the violence I endured. I got into an altercation with some guys one night in a park in Tokyo, and I was beaten within an inch of my life. I had to get out of the area as I thought they would be back. I remember moving from place to place, and it was all a bit of a blur. Somehow, I ended up way up in the sticks, close to the mountains, and eventually, I ended up living in an abandoned shrine. It wasn't so bad. I would walk down to the village and exchange my labor for food in the village. You might think that living in an abandoned shrine might be scary, but I can tell you that there was only one thing I was scared of at the time: people. I would offer my services to anyone who had work available. I like to think of myself as a jack of all trades, an all-rounder. I would often go to ask people on the street or go door to door trying to drum up some work. Once, a guy asked me what services I could offer. "Pretty much anything," I said. He then pulled a gun out, cocked the trigger, and put it against my head. "It's loaded," he said. You can imagine how I felt. He put the gun away and said, "I just wanted to point a loaded gun at a human." Then he threw some money my way and left. I guess that the cash he threw was what he deemed the value of my life to be. Not long after that, a gang found out where I had been living. They came late one night. When they found me, one said a phrase so off-putting, I don't think I will ever forget it. "You have no human rights." He had already dehumanized me. They carried sticks, iron bars, and metal pipes and came at me. It was too late to escape, and when they were through, I was left with a broken leg. It was hell. At the same time, I experienced such a lack of humanity. I also experienced the opposite. The farmer I had worked for in the village brought food to me when he had heard about the gang attack and even paid for my hospital bills. If it wasn't for him, I probably wouldn't have been found, and I might have starved to death in my makeshift home. There was no way I could have got down the mountain to the village with a broken leg. I owed that man my life. I asked if there was a way that I could repay him, and he just replied, "Ah, hell, why don't you try and grow some vegetables or something? Make yourself a living. Pay me back something when you get set up, and there's no rush." I learned a lot about agricultural work from him. Even when he gave me a method to repay his generosity, I felt like I was still getting more than I was giving. The soil by the shrine was hard, and nothing much would grow, but I was determined to pay him back. I would go to the river countless times a day to fetch water. Eventually, I made some serious progress. This joy was short-lived. A group of people who were into urban exploration came to the abandoned shrine and trashed my little farm. They stomped over all my plants. Why? I had nothing, yet people still wanted to take from me. Something snapped in me. I felt robbed, and I wanted someone to pay for it. I kept a 2x4 with me at all times. I decided to be ready for whoever wanted to mess with me. Living that way made me happy. Fight or flight, a return to animal instincts. I knew that all humans were capable of terrible acts. I grew less trustworthy. I was always scared of spirits and ghosts, but humans are worse. It was at this point I started seeing things. I thought the shrine was haunted. I decided if there was something else with me in the shrine, I wanted to be of service to the shrine since the farm wasn't working out. I had learned some carpentry skills when I was younger. I thought I would try to clean up the place and mend some things. Maybe if the shrine looked a bit more maintained, it would keep the urban explorers and the gangs away. Being busy took my mind off my hate for those who sought to hurt me. I started to speak to God, or whatever the spirits that inhabited the shrine were. I would say hello and goodbye, at first to myself, and then quietly, but in the end, I was talking loudly like there was someone with me. Eventually, the shrine looked pretty good. I started to see the ghost again. She was a beautiful woman, and she was so pleased that I had cleaned up the shrine. She would just sit there and comb her gorgeous hair. Sometimes I wouldn't even see her, I would just hear some rummaging noises. I felt that I had some company, and I enjoyed it. The gang came back one night, the same gang which attacked me and broke my leg. They laughed at me when I called for help, when I called to her. But they weren't laughing when my friend who owned the farm arrived with his hunting rifle. They never came back after that. Since he saved me, I decided to stop being so hateful, and I put that energy in agriculture. I still needed to pay him back, even though he wasn't expecting anything from me. I was determined, and through years of hard work, dedication, and support from my friend, I managed to hone my skills. I found some land to rent, used it, did well, and kept repeating. Now I own several plots, and I have several employees. I usually offer work to those who are in the same position as me, the homeless. And as for my friend, I paid him back. I bought him several plots of land by the mountains. Finding a partner hasn't really worked out for me, but whenever I am down, I seem to dream about the spirit of the woman in the shrine. Sometimes I think I was rescued by someone other than my farmer friend. So, my next project is restoring the shrine to its former glory and reinstating a priest there.
This happened a few minutes ago. I had just taken my freshly baked vanilla and cinnamon raisin cakes out of the oven and wanted to snap a photo of them to send to my best friend and my aunt. My camera had the AI option activated because I forgot to disable it after my outing on Friday night. As I turned my camera towards the kitchen table, the AI frame showed a food sign since I snapped a picture of the cakes, and when facing the kitchen table and kitchen door, it showed a person sign. The person sign appears when the AI feature detects a person's presence. The thing is, I was alone. My parents were napping, and my sister was in her room studying. My aunt was working at her boyfriend's family farm, trying to finish before sundown and before the rain moved in. The house is my mom and aunt's childhood home. My grandmother lived in it from 1983 to 2017, She died in her sleep in her room, which is now my parents' current bedroom. All of us have experienced something that might be considered to be a presence. We'd feel a hand on our backs, shoulders, or heads, as I have mentioned before in other posts, but never captured anything on a camera or radio. Although my computer turns on by itself in the middle of the night, or during the day when it's in sleep mode, I don't think that has anything to do with a ghost. I found it odd because I didn't feel a presence, but the person sign remained on for a moment when I placed the camera in the same spot again. A second after I realized what had happened, it showed nothing. If there's a ghost after all, I think it's either my grandma or my grandpa, or both of them keeping an eye on us. Maybe they, she, or he wanted to see how the cakes turned out. I thought to share this because it's nothing spooky. It's something wholesome in my mind, and maybe it'll cheer someone up.
The doorbell rang after 1:30 a.m. The movie The Vikings with Tony Curtis and Kirk Douglas was on downstairs, music blaring while my mum was busying herself around. She was a night owl, but this night she was up until my dad got home. They had fought earlier, and he went out for the night with business associates. She was supposed to accompany them but refused, so he went alone. I had just returned from looking for him. He had called just before 1 a.m. He thought I was my mum. He asked me to pick him up. I could tell he had been drinking. "Stay where you are, Dad. I'm on my way." At 1:06 a.m., just as I'm walking out the door, he calls again.
"I'll be walking and waving my arms,"
he slurred on repeat. "No, Dad. Stay where you are. I'm leaving now." When I got there, I could not find him. Every time I tried, I was pushed back by the blast of late December air. But there was a car, turned the wrong way on the dark, rural, 2-lane road, with a rumpled up hood and a windshield busted out. Wow, I thought. They must have hit a deer. No cops yet. No ambulance. I got there before they did. I opened our front door shortly after I got home to a police officer and a minister. I'll never forget, till the day I die, the minister. His dark skin, set off by his large, compassionate dark eyes that stared right into me. Afraid for me, reaching out to me, knowing he was about to change my life. The officer asked me if my mum was home. Yes, I answered. If this is about my dad, I was just looking for him, I said with a casual, almost friendly tone to hide my apprehension.
"We need to speak to your mother,"
was the officer's curt response. His "just the facts, ma'am" demeanor was more than matched by the compassion the minister gave me by his full-on profound stare. While I was hanging up my coat, I heard the minister tell my mum,
"There's been an accident, and your husband was killed."
He died at 1:11 a.m. Dad and Mum were 40. I was 19. Home from school. It was just after Christmas. My siblings were younger and all still in school. The rest of the night was a whir of hospital, identify the body visits, the priest, phone calls, drives to the place he died and back again, and sitting around in disbelief. What do we do now? He was the most powerful man in the world. He was gone. We were adrift. It was a long time before I could sleep again. I think it was not until later that next night. People were calling. Small town, so it was the headline on the front page that morning. Pedestrian killed on X road. I know because my boyfriend at the time and I ran out and bought the paper at dawn. papers. I still have mine. People kept coming over, bringing food, crying, needing comfort. The janitor from my former high school was the first person to call with condolences. Dad was very loved. We were numb. Mum was melting. I had to step up. I finally had enough and went to bed. Everyone else remained talking downstairs. Mum was still up, so were siblings, 2 to 4. I decided to go lie down in Mum and Dad's bed, on his side of the bed, and buried my face in his pillow. It smelled like him. Lying flat on my stomach, I silently cried myself to sleep in the darkness. He'd been dead now about 24 hours. How was that possible? At some point, I was awakened by someone sitting on the bed, stroking my hair. It was a real, genuine, sensory touch. Comforting, loving. I felt it from a dead, exhausted sleep state. No mistaking it. So real that when it woke me up, I reached up expecting to touch my mum's hand. Empty space. "Mum?" I said as I rolled over. Silence. "Mum? Is that you?" Electric stillness. I reached out from the bed and waved my arm back and forth in the darkness. Nothing. No one. I sat up. "Mum!" Dead silence. Dead darkness. I got up, ran out of the room and sprang to the top of the stairs. "Mum!" "Yes?" she replied. "Were you just up here in your room, trying to wake me up?" Pin drop. "No, honey," she said softly. "I just felt you rubbing my hair," I implored, almost begging. Pause. "It wasn't me, sweetheart," she said flatly. But it had been so real. It woke me up. I ran all the way down the stairs and just looked at her. We just stared. Tears started to well up in her eyes, then in mine too. We didn't say another word. We didn't have to. I turned away, staring at the floor, and just whispered to myself, "I love you too, Dad." Hello, watchers and listeners. Happy holidays. I hope you enjoyed this year's collection of wholesome and sad ghost stories. I always find it's a nice reminder to love and appreciate who and what you have. A huge thank you to my fellow narrators who really came through for me this year on such short notice. Words cannot express my gratitude. A huge thank you to all the authors of the stories, and especially to those who submitted their own. To Jane Nightmares for giving me stories to read, and also to the narrators who brought their own stories, since I had trouble sourcing enough stories for this year. I'm so proud to be able to work with such great people in such a fantastic community. And of course, the biggest thank you goes to you, the listener. Stay safe this holiday season. And remember,
Papa loves you.